needs to be. Don't rely on the visual layout of your graphical EQ. Rely on the number. So in other words, again, if your EQ gives you decibel increases or decreases, try to discipline yourself and just do things maybe by 1 or 2 decibel increments. All right, and let me move on to the next tip here because it's related to some of the things that we've just talked about. I highly recommend using a spectrum analyzer, and you can get this in plug-in form, and it basically analyzes the frequencies that are playing in your song, everything from the high end all the way over to the left side of your EQ, which will be the low end of which we've been talking about. So with that in mind, there is a chance that your kick drum and your bass instrument, they may be occupying the same area of the spectrum or on the EQ. And a spectrum analyzer will help you see where those areas are. Ideally, you do not want the kick drum or your 808 to occupy the same frequency band as your bass instrument. So for instance, if you were to turn your spectrum analyzer on your bass instrument and you're seeing that it's really peaking near the 60 hertz area consistently, and then you turn on your kick drum and you see that the kick drum is peaking consistently near the 60 hertz area, that means those two instruments are overlapping and occupying, for the most part, that same frequency. It's going to cause your low end to sound very one-dimensional, and quite frankly, it can cause it to sound muddy because in essence, those two will be kind of stepping on one another. So what you want to do, as an example, you can cut all of the frequencies that are above 60 hertz for your kick drum. And then you can cut everything that's below 60 hertz for your bass instrument. And that 60 hertz threshold will kind of be like that crossover point where the kick drum ends and the bass instrument takes over. But those two instruments kind of playing side by side will allow for a more robust, fuller presence on the left side of the spectrum. Maybe it's, in between 20 hertz all the way up to, like 80 or 90 hertz. That whole area could be occupied by these two instruments playing together versus being redundant or stepping on top of the same frequencies. This particular tip will be better understood by looking at the graphic on this episode's show notes page. So please look at episode 59. And again, to find that, go to our website, successwithmusic.com. Go to episode 59 by clicking on the podcast link in the menu. Scroll to episode 59, go below the music player, and you will see a picture of a spectrum analyzer or an EQ, a graphic EQ that has made space for both a bass instrument and a kick drum. Next tip here, I highly recommend using a reference track, right? So whenever you're trying to get that low end, again, you can sit by yourself and just keep cranking up the low end, but is it really banging or is it not? Is it really hitting hard or is it not? So I always recommend loading up a reference track being a commercially released song, preferably in your genre. Take a listen to it, drag that song into your digital audio workstation. I'll do the old A-B comparison. On one track, have your completed song, play it, listen to the bass. On track 2, for instance, let's have that song of that nationally known artist or that commercially released song and listen to that. Listen to the low end frequencies and see if there are any notable differences in the overall depth of the bass in that song, meaning how far is it going to the left on the EQ, and also how loud are those low end frequencies. There have been many times where I've done this and I realized that my track, I've completely lost my mind and gone wild with how much low end I have in my track as compared to a nationally released or commercially released track. So having a reference track to understand how others are allowing their bass to sit or their low end to sit within their track is incredibly helpful. Next tip, for all of your low end instruments, your kick drums, your bass synths or your bass guitars and things like that, if you have like kettle drums or whatever, 808s, make sure that they are dead center if you are looking to make that low end bang. So for instance, if you have an 808 that's coming in panned, like let's say 25% to the left or 30% to the left, or God forbid, like 100% to the left, maybe that might work in some genre. I don't know what it is, but to me, your bass will never feel like it's just hitting really hard if it's not done dead center or preferably in mono. So make sure that that kick drum, make sure that that bass instrument is dead center. Put it in mono. That way, the energy from those two speakers, if you're doing a stereo scenario, we're not talking about surround sound here, but the energy from those two speakers, they're hitting your ears equally, or the listener's ears equally, and it has more perceived energy and power. Next thing here, please resist the urge to mindlessly use bass-related plugins. So there are all kinds of plugins, paid, freemium plugins, where they talk about giving you like out of this world bass. And they have these presets and you're out there like, oh yeah, club bass, activate. And you do that and you just expect that magically that plugin will somehow or another just make your tracks bang like nationally known artists. It doesn't always happen that way. A lot of times these plugins are merely bass boosters. They're doing the same thing as what an EQ would do, except for there's a preset. It may just boost it at certain frequencies. So please be careful with mindlessly using plugins. Understand how they work. I do know that there are a few plugins out there that promise to, make your track, sound really full on different types of speakers and things like that. We'll talk about in the very next tip here. But just be very careful about thinking that a plugin is some magic bullet, some magic pill that if you just take it, if you just buy it, it will somehow or another miraculously do the work of an engineer and make your song like the hottest thing ever. I'm not against you using plugins, but my belief is that if you follow some of the tips that I mentioned prior, you may be able to achieve a similar, if not better, sound by tweaking things with deliberate thought and some good common sense, as we outlined earlier. On my next tip here, I highly recommend running low-end instruments on a separate bus. So this is kind of similar to where we started at the very beginning with the tips. I mentioned in, tip number 3, I believe, where you should reduce the volume of the instruments that are not, like a kick or a bass instrument. Well, an easy way to get that done is simply to put your kick, everything that bangs on the low end, put it on one sub. And that way you can kind of drag that sub up or down to let it sit in the mix overall in a good way. So instead of kind of fiddling around with the bass and the kick drum and whatever else that may be on the low end, put all of that stuff on one bus and have all your other instrumentation on separate buses or a separate bus, and play with the relationship between the low frequencies. Collectively, you dial them in. And again, once you get them close, you're not making these wild swings in adjustments. You're just doing like a decibel or a couple of decibels of changes. All right, so last tip here. Know that your bass experience when listening in different or on different things will vary widely, right? So if you are playing, your track on your smartphone speaker, well, obviously your low end is not going to have the same fullness as sitting in a studio with a 12-inch woofer, right? If you're listening to, on like some cheaper headphones, you're not going to get that experience. If you have Bluetooth speaker or wireless speaker, those things are limited just because of the size of the actual speaker set up there, and so they may not be able to give you that full power that you're looking for. You obviously know that. The reason why I'm bringing this up is I've heard about people when they're doing their mix, trying to make their songs bang really hard on everything, in every place, in cars, on headphones. I get it. But always remember, if you're chasing that mythical Thicc Bass, make sure you're doing that with a reference track, because sometimes you will take your song and put it on your phone, and then you're listening on your speaker, and then you're in the car, and you're over here, and you're thinking, this is weak, this is not coming through hard, I want this to go harder. Well, make sure that you're using those reference tracks in those different places as well. Are those commercially released songs having the same impact as your song? You may find out that if you've done all the things that we've talked about, you are keeping up with that commercially released sound. So again, never test your song on these different systems without a reference track. If you do, you may wind up doing what I mentioned earlier, which is overcorrecting, cranking the dBs up, on your EQ, like by a huge amount. And yeah, ain't nobody got time for that. Hey, I appreciate you listening to the podcast today. Again, my name is Walt. I hope you had a good time learning. Make sure you check out our website, successwithmusic.com. Also, make sure you subscribe to the podcast when we drop content. You'll be the first to know about it. We're on Spotify. We're on Apple Podcasts. If you got a second, we thrive on positive reviews. It helps us to keep this going. We're not charging, right? So that's the least you can do as a listener. So help us out, and we'll see you on the next episode.
$10 of gas won't fill the tank. No, this just gets old. I know there's gotta be a better way for me in this life. That is my dream.